The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Ouagadougou, a furnace in the sky that seemed intent on testing the endurance of every living thing below. Heat waves shimmered above the dusty streets, distorting the air and creating mirages that danced in the distance. The earth itself seemed to exhale warmth, as if the very ground was breathing fire. Yet despite the oppressive heat, life in the marketplace continued, with its usual vibrant cacophony, a symphony of human activity that no weather could silence. Vendors stationed under makeshift, canopies of patched cloth and wooden poles, hawked their wares with practiced enthusiasm. Colorful pyramids of mangoes, papayas, and oranges formed brilliant displays that caught the eye even in the harsh sunlight. The scent of fresh bread wafted from clay ovens, mixing with the earthy aroma of roasted peanuts being turned in large metal pans over open flames. The vendors' voices competed with each other, each one calling out prices and extolling the quality of their goods, creating a rhythmic chant that formed the heartbeat of the marketplace. Children darted between the stalls with the fearless energy that only youth possesses, playing games of tag and laughing with pure, uninhibited joy. Some helped their parents, carrying small baskets or watching over younger siblings. Others simply explored, their curious eyes taking in everything, absorbing the lessons of community life that no school could teach. An old woman sat in the shade, weaving baskets with fingers that moved with the automatic precision of decades of practice. Occasionally calling out greetings to passers-by she had known since they were children themselves. Women moved through the market with purpose and skill, their brightly patterned wraps swirling around them as they walked. They bargained with the expertise of generations, knowing exactly how much to offer, when to walk away, when to compromise. Their conversations created a constant murmur of female voices discussing not just prices but family news, community concerns, shared wisdom about children, health, and the countless challenges and joys of daily existence. Men gathered in small groups at the edges of the marketplace, seated on wooden benches or standing in the shade of buildings. They discussed the day's events over small cups of sweet tea served in glass tumblers, the tea itself a ritual of hospitality and connection. Some played checkers on makeshift boards, others simply talked about politics, about farming, about the upcoming rains, about everything and nothing. Their presence created nodes of masculine energy throughout the marketplace, counterbalancing the movement and commerce with contemplation and community. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, this daily dance of human interaction that had repeated itself for generations, an unusual tension simmered. It was subtle but unmistakable, a tightness in shoulders, a distraction in conversations, a frequent glancing toward the main road. On every tongue was a single phrase, repeated in whispers and shouts, in anxious questions and confident proclamations. "The French are coming." The news had spread through the city like wildfire at dawn, reaching every corner, every home, every heart, with the speed that only truly significant news achieves. It had started in the presidential palace, official word delivered through proper channels, but within hours it had become public knowledge, transformed and elaborated through the natural alchemy of community communication. Now everyone knew, everyone had an opinion. Everyone wondered what this visit would mean. In some faces, hope flickered like a candle flame in darkness. Perhaps this visit would strengthen their nation's international relationships, bring new opportunities for trade and development, or forge beneficial alliances that could help their young nation navigate the complex politics of the global stage. Perhaps these foreign visitors would see Ouagadougou with fresh eyes, recognize its potential, appreciate its culture, and become genuine partners rather than condescending benefactors. In others, worry clouded their features like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What tone would these foreigners adopt? Would they speak with respect, treating Ouagadougou as an equal partner in international dialogue? Or would they speak with the condescension that had marked so many colonial encounters, that barely concealed attitude of superiority that suggested they were here to help backward people who couldn't help themselves? Would they see human beings or merely projects? Would they recognize dignity or only poverty? Whispered conversations filled the tea houses and market squares, the same questions repeated in different words, but all expressing the same underlying anxiety. Will they honor us as equals? An elderly man asked his companion, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully, his weathered face creased with concern, born of lived experience. Or will they treat us as they always have, as lesser beings, worthy only of their pity or their exploitation? His companion, equally aged, nodded slowly, remembering too much history to be easily optimistic. Another voice cut through the murmurs, belonging to a middle-aged merchant who had traveled to Europe and seen firsthand how Africans were often perceived there. I have heard stories from other nations. These Western delegations arrive with smiles that don't reach their eyes, but behind those smiles lie daggers of judgment and superiority. They shake our hands while mentally cataloging all the ways we fail to meet their standards. A young mother, holding her child close to her chest in a wrap of bright cloth, spoke quietly to her neighbor, her voice carrying the weight of inherited pain. My grandmother told me of the days when such visitors would not even acknowledge our existence. They would walk among us as if we were invisible, as if our lives, our struggles, our dignity meant nothing, as if we were part of the landscape rather than people with dreams and fears and hopes just like them. She said it was one of the deepest wounds, not just to be exploited, but to be seen as less than fully human. Every heart harbored an invisible restlessness, a collective anxiety about what this visit would bring. The memory of colonialism still lingered in the national consciousness, not as ancient history relegated to textbooks, but as a living wound that had not fully healed. The older generation carried these memories in their bones. The forced labor, the arbitrary cruelty, the systematic diminishment of their culture and language. The message repeated in 1,000 ways that they were inferior, primitive, childlike people who needed European guidance to achieve even basic civilization. The people of Ouagadougou had worked tirelessly to build their nation after independence, to establish their identity, to stand proud on the world stage. Every school built, every road paved, every hospital opened represented not just practical development, but a statement. We are capable. We are worthy. We belong among the community of nations. And now, once again, they would be measured by foreign eyes, assessed by foreign standards, and quite possibly found wanting by people who would never think to question whether their own standards were universal. Truths, or merely cultural preferences, elevated to the status of absolutes. The sun seemed to climb even higher as the appointed hour approached, and the heat became almost unbearable. Vendors sought deeper shade, children slowed their games, women fanned themselves with whatever came to hand. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Suddenly, the distant rumble of engines announced the arrival, the sound carrying across the dusty expanse with mechanical certainty. The conversation ceased abruptly as everyone turned toward the sound, bodies tensing, breath catching. Large, gleaming vehicles with dark-tinted windows rolled through the central marketplace, their polish and modernity standing in stark contrast to the dusty, unpaved streets they traversed. These were expensive automobiles, the kind that spoke of wealth and power, each one probably worth more than most families in the marketplace would earn in a lifetime. The convoy moved slowly, deliberately, as if to emphasize its importance and give everyone time to witness this display of European sophistication and technological superiority. The engines purred with quiet efficiency, so different from the sputtering motorbikes and aging trucks that usually traveled these roads. The vehicles seemed almost alien in this environment, visitors from another world entirely. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a path through the marketplace, bodies pressing back against stalls and buildings. Children stopped their games mid-motion, standing transfixed by the spectacle, their young eyes wide with fascination at these magnificent machines. Some clapped excitedly, thrilled by the unusual sight of such impressive automobiles, their innocent enthusiasm not yet tempered by the complications of historical resentment or political awareness. They simply saw something new and exciting, and they responded with the honest joy of childhood. But the adults watched with more complex emotions, curiosity mixed with apprehension, hope tinged with wariness, pride fighting with anxiety. They wanted to welcome genuine friendship, but feared condescension disguised as cooperation. They hoped for respect, but braced themselves for judgment. Their faces revealed this internal conflict, these competing impulses that made simple emotions impossible. All eyes fixed on the central vehicle as it came to a halt. The door opened with mechanical precision, and from it emerged a tall, slender woman. Her blonde hair was arranged in a severe, perfectly neat style that suggested both discipline and rigidity. She wore an expensive tailored suit, her posture radiating authority and control. But it was her face that captured everyone's attention. A cold, calculated smile played on her lips, a smile that failed to reach her eyes, a smile that seemed more like a diplomatic mask than a genuine expression of warmth. This was Madame Lucille Moreau, head of the French delegation. She carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, someone who had never doubted her place at the top of whatever hierarchy she encountered. Her movements were measured, efficient, almost military in their precision. Her gaze swept across the assembled crowd with the detachment of a scientist observing specimens under a microscope. She did not wave to the children who had clapped for her arrival. She did not smile at the women who had gathered to witness this moment. She did not acknowledge the respectful nods of the men who stood watching. Her eyes remained fixed straight ahead, as if the people surrounding her were merely shadows, background scenery of no consequence to her important mission. The murmuring began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat fields. "Did you see how she looked right through us?" whispered one woman to another. "As if we don't exist at all." "Such arrogance," muttered an old vendor, shaking his head. "She walks among us as if she owns the very ground beneath her feet." A young student, home from university, observed quietly to his friend. "Look at her face. She has already judged us. In her mind, she has already catalogued us as inferior, as primitive, as people who need her wisdom and her civilization. She doesn't see human beings here. She sees a project, a mission, a burden she must nobly undertake." The crowd's initial curiosity transformed into something more complex, a mixture of indignation, hurt pride, and a stubborn determination to prove their worth. This was not the first time Ouagadougou had faced such attitudes, and the collective memory of the people held generations of similar slights and dismissals. Inside the presidential palace, President Ibrahim Traoré waited for his guests. He was a young man, yet he carried himself with extraordinary dignity and patience. Those who knew him spoke of his deep love for his people, his unwavering respect for the wisdom of elders, and his commitment to justice in every decision. Unlike many leaders who isolated themselves in positions of power, Ibrahim remained connected to the everyday lives of his citizens. He walked among them, listened to them, and understood that true leadership meant service, not domination. As he prepared to receive the French delegation, Ibrahim reflected on the challenge before him. He knew Madame Moreau's reputation. She was known throughout diplomatic circles as someone who believed firmly in the superiority of Western civilization. She had written papers advocating for what she called educational interventions in developing nations, arguing that they needed French guidance to achieve proper governance and social organization. Ibrahim's advisors had warned him, "She comes not to learn but to lecture. She comes not to respect but to reform. She sees us as students who have failed to complete our lessons in civilization." But Ibrahim had smiled at their concerns. "Let her come," he had said. "Let her bring all her assumptions, all her prejudices, all her certainty. We will not respond with anger or defensive pride. We will respond with truth. We will show her who we really are, and in doing so, we will offer her the greatest gift, the opportunity to shed her ignorance and discover genuine wisdom." When Madame Moreau entered the palace's reception hall, her eyes immediately swept across the room with an appraising, critical gaze. The furnishings were simple by European standards: locally crafted furniture, woven textiles, traditional art on the walls. To someone like Madame Moreau, who had spent her life in Paris's ornate governmental buildings and elegant embassies, this seemed almost primitive. She leaned slightly toward her assistant and whispered, loud enough for several nearby ears to catch. "What an old and plain building." One would think a presidential palace would demonstrate some level of sophistication and modern development. The comment struck like a slap across the faces of those who heard it. These were the halls that had witnessed their nation's birth, where their founding fathers had debated and shaped their constitution, where countless decisions had been made for the welfare of the people. The simplicity was not poverty, it was a choice, a statement that leadership should not separate itself from the people through displays of excessive wealth. Several officials' faces flushed red with anger and hurt, but discipline held. They remained silent, their eyes turning to President Ibrahim to see how he would respond to this casual insult. Ibrahim stepped forward with calm grace, extending his hand in the traditional greeting. Madame Moreau shook it perfunctorily, her grip brief and formal, as if physical contact with him was merely a diplomatic obligation she must endure. "President Traoré," she said, her tone carrying the condescension of a teacher addressing a struggling student. "I hope that today you are prepared to learn something valuable from our discussions." The room fell into profound silence. The implication hung in the air like smoke. She had not come to engage in mutual dialogue between equals. She had come to instruct, to correct, to improve what she perceived as deficient. All eyes turned to Ibrahim, waiting to see how their young president would handle such blatant disrespect. Some expected anger. Others hoped for a sharp retort that would put this arrogant woman in her place. But Ibrahim simply smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that held no trace of defensiveness or aggression. "Madame Moreau," he replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of deep wisdom, "we have a saying in our culture. The river does not announce its own depth, but those who treat it carelessly may find themselves drowning in waters they did not respect." Madame Moreau's expression flickered with confusion. She did not understand the proverb, could not grasp its meaning or its warning. She smiled thinly and took her seat, dismissing the words as mere quaint folklore, the kind of simple wisdom that so-called traditional societies clung to in the absence of real knowledge. But around the room, those who had heard the exchange looked at one another with knowing glances. They understood perfectly. Their president had just delivered a message wrapped in courtesy. Her arrogance was noted, her disrespect acknowledged, and a warning given. His patience was not weakness but strength. His silence was not submission but wisdom waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The delegation settled into their seats for the formal welcome ceremony. Madame Moreau adjusted her jacket, opened her briefcase filled with documents and reports, ready to begin her educational mission. She had prepared extensively statistics about development indices, recommendations for governmental reforms, suggestions for educational restructuring. She was confident that by the end of this visit, she would have planted seeds of necessary change in this struggling nation. She had no idea that she was the one about to receive an education. The next morning dawned with the usual brilliance of an African sunrise, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. President Ibrahim had arranged for Madame Moreau to visit one of the villages on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. When he announced this plan, her face registered visible displeasure. "A village?" she asked, barely concealing her disdain. "President Traoré, surely there are more important venues for our discussions. I have limited time here, and I had hoped to focus on substantive policy matters, not tourism." Ibrahim's smile never wavered. "Madame, you cannot understand a nation's heart by studying only its capital. The soul of Ouagadougou lives in our villages, in the daily lives of our people. If you truly wish to offer us guidance, should you not first understand who we are?" Unable to refuse without appearing completely dismissive, Madame Moreau agreed with obvious reluctance. The convoy left the palace, traveling roads that gradually transformed from paved streets to dirt paths. Through the vehicle's windows, the landscape shifted from urban structures to rural beauty, fields of crops, scattered acacia trees, children herding goats. Madame Moreau watched with a mixture of pity and superiority. "Look at this poverty," she murmured to her assistant. "No infrastructure, no modern amenities. These people need so much help to join the modern world. Her assistant, a younger diplomat who had traveled more extensively and with more open eyes, hesitated before responding. "Madame, perhaps we should reserve judgment until we understand their lives better." Madame Moreau shot him a sharp look. "I have spent my career studying development. I know poverty when I see it." When they arrived at the village, the scene that greeted them was unexpected. Despite the simple mud brick houses and lack of modern buildings, the village was alive with vibrant activity. Women sang as they worked, their voices harmonizing in traditional songs that had been passed down through generations. Drums began to beat in rhythmic welcome, the sound carrying across the open space. Children emerged from houses carrying flowers, their faces bright with excitement and joy. This was not the dejected, desperate poverty that Madame Moreau had expected. This was a community alive with culture, with connection, with purpose. The confusion was evident on her face as she stepped from the vehicle. "Why are they celebrating?" she asked Ibrahim. "Why this festive reception when they have so little?" Ibrahim gestured toward the gathering crowd. "Madame, they celebrate because a guest has arrived. In our culture, a visitor is considered a blessing, an opportunity to share our lives and learn from one another. They do not celebrate wealth. They celebrate connection." The villagers approached, maintaining a respectful distance but with open, curious faces. Madame Moreau noticed that they did not avert their eyes as she might have expected from people she considered so far beneath her station. Instead, they looked directly at her, measuring her with the same assessing gaze she had used on them. Ibrahim led her to a raised platform in the village center, a simple structure made of wood and stone, worn smooth by years of use. This was the village's gathering place, where disputes were settled, stories were told, celebrations were held, and community decisions were made. Seated on this platform was an elderly woman, her hands working steadily at weaving a basket. Her fingers, though aged and trembling slightly, moved with practiced skill. Despite her apparent frailty, her eyes were sharp and clear, holding a depth of wisdom that comes only from a life fully lived. "Madame," Ibrahim said gently, "this is Grandmother Amina. She is one of our village's most respected storytellers. I have asked her to share something with you." Madame Moreau's expression revealed her thoughts clearly. She had not traveled thousands of miles to listen to an illiterate old woman tell folk tales. She had reports to present, reforms to recommend, systems to explain. But diplomatic protocol demanded she at least appear interested. The elderly woman looked up from her weaving, her gaze settling on Madame Moreau with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "Once," she began, "there lived a peacock who was very proud of his magnificent feathers. He would strut through the forest displaying his plumage and mock the other birds for their plain appearances. 'Look at you,' he would cry to the sparrows and the doves. 'So dull, so ordinary. I am clearly superior in every way.' The peacock refused to associate with the common birds. He would not eat with them, would not shelter with them, would not learn from them. He believed that his beauty made him essentially different, fundamentally better. Then one day, the rains came. Not the gentle rains that nourish the earth, but a terrible storm that flooded the land. The peacock's beautiful feathers, so light and magnificent in dry weather, became waterlogged and heavy. He could not fly. He could not escape the rising waters. As he struggled, crying out in fear, a small sparrow flew down beside him. "Come," said the sparrow, "hold on to my back. I will help you reach safety." "You?" cried the peacock. "You are too small, too weak. How could you possibly help someone as magnificent as me?" But the sparrow insisted, and the peacock, desperate now, had no choice but to accept. The sparrow carried him to high ground, making many trips, never complaining about the weight or the difficulty. When the storm passed and the peacock's feathers dried, he looked at the sparrow with new eyes. "I thought my beauty made me superior," he said quietly. "But now I understand. True strength is not in appearance, but in the willingness to help others. My pride was not my greatest feature. It was my greatest burden. And your humility was not weakness. It was the freedom to be truly strong." As Grandmother Amina finished her story, the villagers erupted in applause. Children laughed and clapped, adults nodded in appreciation, and several people called out words of wisdom in response. It was clear that storytelling here was not passive entertainment, but an interactive communal experience. Madame Moreau, however, looked annoyed. "These folk tales are charming," she said with barely concealed impatience, "but I did not come here for children's stories. I came to discuss serious matters, education policy, economic development, governmental reform." Ibrahim's expression remained gentle, but his words carried weight. "Madame, in our culture, the deepest truths are carried in stories. What appears simple on the surface contains layers of meaning that shape how we live, how we treat one another, how we understand our place in the world. Those who listen with their hearts, not just their ears, discover that these simple stories contain wisdom that no amount of formal education can replace." Before Madame Moreau could respond, a young girl approached carrying a clay cup filled with water. The child could not have been more than 8 years old, and her hands trembled slightly as she held out the offering. But in her eyes shone a dignity and pride that belied her youth. "Madame," the girl said in a small but clear voice, "this water is for you. It comes from our village well, and we offer it with respect." Madame Moreau looked at the cup with barely concealed distaste. The vessel was rough clay, clearly handmade, nothing like the fine crystal she was accustomed to. The water itself was probably not purified to Western standards. She had no desire to drink it. Ibrahim spoke quietly beside her. "In our culture, when a child offers water, it is considered one of life's greatest gifts. To refuse would be a profound insult, not just to the child, but to the entire community. It would communicate that you consider yourself too elevated to accept anything from their hands." All eyes were now on Madame Moreau. The village had fallen silent, waiting. The moment stretched, becoming increasingly uncomfortable. She realized that this was a test, perhaps the first real test of this visit. Her instinct was to refuse, to maintain her boundaries, to preserve her sense of superiority. But she also recognized that outright refusal would confirm everything these people might suspect about her attitudes. It would prove that she viewed them as inferior, their offerings as contaminated by their poverty and primitiveness. With visible reluctance, she reached out and took the cup. The clay felt rough against her hands, so different from the smooth surfaces she was used to. She raised it to her lips and took a small sip. The water was cool, clean, and surprisingly refreshing. But more than the physical sensation was the reaction around her. The village erupted in celebration. Drums beat louder. Women ululated with joy. Children danced. And the young girl's face broke into a brilliant smile. For the first time since her arrival, a crack appeared in Madame Moreau's armor of superiority. She found herself unexpectedly moved by their response to such a simple gesture. Why did this matter so much to them? Why did one sip of water provoke such happiness? Ibrahim leaned close and spoke softly. "Madame, you have drunk the water." But understanding why this matters, that is where true respect begins. These people do not judge you by your clothes, your education, or your nation's power. They judge you by whether you are willing to see them as human beings worthy of dignity. Today you took a first step, but it is only a first step. His words pierced through her defenses more deeply than any argument could have. For the first time since arriving in Ouagadougou, Madame Moreau felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the wall of certainty that had always surrounded her worldview. The celebration continued around them, and as Madame Moreau watched the joy on these people's faces over something as simple as sharing water, she found herself thinking, perhaps there is something here I do not understand. Perhaps their simplicity is not poverty but something else. Entirely, something I have never encountered in all my sophisticated education and worldly experience. This thought was disturbing and uncomfortable. It challenged everything she believed about herself and her mission. But like a seed planted in fertile soil, it would grow. The following day brought new revelations. President Ibrahim arranged for Madame Moreau to visit the local school, a modest building with limited resources but abundant energy. When they arrived, Children in colorful, mismatched uniforms stood in neat rows, singing a welcome song with remarkable harmony and enthusiasm. Madame Moreau observed the scene with her practiced, critical eye. She noted the cracked walls, the worn textbooks, the lack of computers or modern educational technology. This confirmed her assumptions. These people desperately needed help to bring their education system up to acceptable standards. But then one of the children, a boy no more than 10 years old, raised his hand and was called forward by the teacher. He stood before the assembly and recited a poem he had written himself. The poem spoke of dignity, of loving one's homeland, of the importance of education, not just for personal advancement, but for serving one's community. The words were simple but profound, delivered with a passion and understanding that surprised Madame Moreau. This child, with so few material resources, seemed to possess a clarity of purpose and moral foundation that many children in wealthy nations lacked. After the recitation, Ibrahim invited Madame Moreau into one of the classrooms. The students sat attentively as their teacher led a discussion about national history, not just dates and facts, but stories of courage, sacrifice, and the struggle for independence. Then a brave student stood up, his young face serious. "President Traoré," he said, "yesterday this woman said our palace was old and plain. Why did you not defend our nation's honor? Why did you not tell her she was wrong?" The classroom fell silent. This was the question many adults had been too polite to ask directly. The children, in their honesty, had given voice to a collective feeling. Ibrahim smiled warmly at the boy. "That is an excellent question, and it shows you are thinking carefully about important matters. Let me answer you this way. When someone throws fire at you, what happens if you throw fire back?" "The fire grows bigger," the boy responded. "Exactly," Ibrahim continued. "But what happens if you pour water on fire?" "It goes out," another student called out. Yes, yesterday Madame Moreau spoke from ignorance, perhaps from arrogance. If I had responded with anger, with defensive pride, I would have simply confirmed her beliefs that we are oversensitive, that we cannot engage in rational discourse, that we need her guidance to learn proper behavior. Instead, I responded with dignity. I showed her that we do not need to shout to be strong, we do not need to boast to demonstrate our worth. The river does not announce its depth, but it is deep nonetheless. Do you understand? The children nodded, and even Madame Moreau found herself listening carefully to this lesson. She was the subject of discussion, yet Ibrahim's words contained no bitterness, no attack, only a gentle but firm assertion of worth that was somehow more powerful than any angry defense could have been. After the school visit, Ibrahim took Madame Moreau to the local hospital. It was a modest facility, clearly operating with limited resources. Beds were full, medical supplies were carefully rationed, equipment was outdated by Western standards. Yet the doctors and nurses moved through their duties with dedication and skill that commanded respect. An elderly patient, his hand Ive attached and his body frail, reached out to grasp Ibrahim's hand as they passed his bed. "President Traoré," the old man said, his voice weak but fervent, "you have never forgotten us. Even in our suffering, you come, you see us, you remember that we matter. May God bless you always." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the ward. Other patients raised their hands in greeting, their faces showing not just medical suffering, but genuine love for their leader. Madame Moreau was stunned. In her experience, citizens typically criticized their leaders, blamed them for every problem, and rarely expressed such genuine affection. "How is this possible?" she asked Ibrahim once they were outside. "In my country, politicians are constantly attacked and blamed. Here, even in a hospital with such limited resources, people praise you. What is this power?" Ibrahim stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Madame, it is not power. It is trust. These people know that I do not live in a palace of gold while they suffer. They know that when decisions must be made about limited resources, those decisions are made fairly, with their welfare as the first priority. They know that I see them not as statistics or populations to be managed, but as human beings with dignity. Trust cannot be bought with speeches or propaganda. It must be earned through consistent action, through genuine care, through the willingness to serve rather than simply to rule. For the first time, Madame Moreau remained silent for a long moment, processing what she had witnessed. Her assumptions about leadership, about the relationship between government and people, were being challenged in ways she could not easily dismiss. On the drive back to the palace, she watched through the window as people waved and called out blessings to Ibrahim. Children ran alongside the vehicle, laughing and shouting his name. Women paused in their work to raise their hands in traditional gestures of respect and affection. This was not staged political theater. This was genuine, organic, deeply felt. That evening, Madame Moreau stood at her window in the presidential palace, unable to sleep. The events of the day played through her mind repeatedly. The boy's question in the classroom haunted her. Why did you not defend our nation's honor? She had insulted these people casually, almost automatically, assuming they would either not notice or not have the standing to challenge her. But Ibrahim's response had been far more devastating than any angry confrontation could have been. He had exposed her rudeness simply by responding with dignity, making her look small through his refusal to descend to smallness himself. For the first time in many years, Madame Moreau felt ashamed. The next morning, President Ibrahim announced that Madame Moreau would visit the central marketplace. She hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of mixing with crowds, of being exposed to the chaos and unpredictability of such a public space. But once again, she could not refuse without appearing completely disconnected from the people she claimed to want to help. The marketplace was a riot of activity, vendors calling out their wares, women bargaining with practiced skill, children weaving through the crowds, the mingled scents of spices, fresh bread, and tropical fruits filling the air. The noise was constant, almost overwhelming. Ibrahim led her to a particular stall where a middle-aged man sold peanuts. His clothing was worn, his shoes repaired multiple times, but his posture was straight and his eyes were clear and bright with life. When he saw President Ibrahim, his face broke into a genuine smile of joy. "President Traoré, you honor my humble stall with your presence." He turned to Madame Moreau. "Do you know what this man has done for people like me? He built a road connecting our villages to the city. Before I had to carry my goods on my back for miles. Now I can bring a cart, I can bring more products, I can actually earn enough to send my children to school. This is not charity, this is dignity. He does not give us fish. He helps us fish for ourselves." Other vendors nearby called out in agreement. "President Traoré understands us. He remembers that we exist. He treats us like human beings." Madame Moreau watched this interaction with growing discomfort. In her nation, she had never seen such genuine affection between the powerful and the common people. The divide was too wide, the differences too emphasized. Leaders were distant figures, criticized and mistrusted. But here there seemed to be a connection that bridged the gap between authority and citizenry. A woman approached, holding the hand of a young boy. She spoke directly to Ibrahim. "My son starts school next month. Before I could never afford the fees, but you eliminated those fees so that every child, rich or poor, can receive education. This is true freedom. Not just freedom from colonialism, but freedom from poverty's chains. My son will read, he will write, he will become something I could never be. And he will know that his nation believed he was worthy of this investment." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy and gratitude. The boy looked up at Ibrahim with absolute trust and admiration. Ibrahim placed his hand gently on the child's head. "Young man, you must study hard. Not for me, not for your mother, but for yourself and for your nation. Education is power, the power to think, to choose, to build a better future." Never forget that. Madame Moreau felt something twist inside her chest. This was not the poverty she had expected to witness. This was richness of a kind she had never truly understood. These people had so little in material terms, yet they possessed something infinitely valuable: dignity, purpose, and genuine hope. Ibrahim led her deeper into the marketplace, where a storyteller had gathered a crowd of children. The man was old, his voice cracked with age, but the children sat transfixed as he wove his tale. Long ago, there was a great mountain who believed himself the most important thing in all the world. He looked down at the valley below, at the small stream that ran there, and he mocked it. "You are so small, so weak," the mountain said. "I am mighty and eternal. I will stand forever while you merely trickle past." Meaningless and forgotten, the stream said nothing, but continued flowing day after day, year after year. Then one day, the mountain's volcanic fire burst forth. Lava began to flow, threatening to consume everything in its path. The mountain cried out, "I am destroying myself. I am too powerful. I cannot contain my own strength." But the stream, the small, weak stream that the mountain had mocked, began to flow faster. Its water cooled the lava, absorbed the heat, prevented the destruction. Slowly, day by day, the stream's gentle persistence accomplished what no forceful action could have achieved. When the danger passed, the mountain understood. True greatness is not in standing alone in proud isolation. True greatness is in serving others, in connection, in the humble work of sustaining life. The stream was not weak, it was the very source of strength. The children erupted in applause, calling out their appreciation for the story. Madame Moreau realized with a shock that this story was about her proud assumption of superiority, about her dismissal of these people as inconsequential. The storyteller had never looked at her, never mentioned her by name, but the message was unmistakable. As they walked back through the marketplace, people began to gather, calling out, "Our dignity is our identity. Our unity is our strength. We stand together." The voices grew louder, merging into a chant that filled the air. This was not an organized demonstration, it was a spontaneous expression of collective pride and solidarity. Madame Moreau's legs felt weak. She found herself struggling with emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel: humility, uncertainty, and the first uncomfortable stirrings of genuine respect for these people she had so easily dismissed. Back at the palace, Ibrahim spoke to her quietly. "Madam, today you heard the voice of the people. Leadership does not come from the throne or the palace, it comes from earning the trust of those you serve. The love these people show me is not because I am powerful, but because I see them, I hear them, and I work for their dignity every day. This cannot be bought with money or imposed with force. It can only be earned through genuine service." That night, Madame Moreau stood at her window looking out at the city. The simple houses, the unpaved streets, the lack of modern infrastructure, all of it looked different now. She was beginning to see not poverty, but a different kind of wealth. Not the wealth of things, but the wealth of community, of purpose, of dignity maintained in the face of hardship. For the first time in her accomplished career, Madame Lucille Moreau realized that she might not have all the answers. The thought was terrifying. Morning arrived with a different energy. Madame Moreau had barely slept, her mind churning with uncomfortable revelations. She looked at herself in the mirror. The same expensive suit, the same carefully arranged hair, the same professional appearance. But something in her eyes had changed. The absolute certainty was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. President Ibrahim had arranged one final visit to the farmlands surrounding the city. Madame Moreau agreed without her usual resistance. Something was shifting inside her, and she found herself actually wanting to see more, to understand better. The convoy traveled along rough roads until they reached expansive fields where farmers worked under the climbing sun. The land stretched out in shades of green and gold, crops in various stages of growth, irrigation channels cutting through the fields. Farmers bent to their labor with practiced efficiency. When Ibrahim's vehicle appeared, the farmers straightened, raised their tools in greeting, and called out welcome. An older farmer approached, his clothing stained with honest soil, his hands rough from years of work, but his bearing dignified. "President Traoré," the man said, his voice carrying across the field. "You built the irrigation system that saves our crops during the dry season. This is not just infrastructure, this is life itself. You did not have to do this. We are just farmers, not wealthy people, not important people. But you saw us anyway. You remembered that we feed the nation." Other farmers gathered around, nodding in agreement. "He does not forget the people who work the land." One called out, He knows that a nation is built from the ground up, not from palaces down." Another added. Ibrahim walked out into the field, and to Madame Moreau's surprise, he knelt down and took a handful of soil in his hand. He held it up, letting it sift slowly through his fingers. "Madame," he said, "this soil is everything. It gives us food, it gives us life, it connects us to our ancestors who worked this same land. A leader who forgets the soil forgets the foundation of everything. You cannot build a nation from the top down. You build it from the bottom up, from the earth itself." An elderly woman approached, a young boy riding on her shoulders. She called out, "This is my grandson. He will learn to work this land, to respect it, to understand that dignity comes from honest labor. He will go to school, yes, but he will never forget that the earth is where we all come from and where we will all return. This is wisdom, not the kind you find in books, but the kind you find in living." Madame Moreau watched as Ibrahim walked among the farmers, speaking with them individually, asking about their families, their challenges, their hopes. This was not a political photo opportunity, this was genuine connection. And the farmers responded with openness and trust that was almost shocking in its authenticity. One younger farmer spoke up, "Madam, can I ask you something?" He waited for her surprised nod before continuing. "In your country, do leaders walk in the fields with farmers? Do they kneel in the soil? Do they remember that food does not come from supermarkets but from the hands of people like us?" The question was not aggressive, merely curious, but it struck deep. Madame Moreau found herself unable to answer immediately. When was the last time she had seen a French president walk through agricultural fields, speak intimately with farmers, touch the soil with reverence? Such things simply did not happen in her world of diplomatic receptions and policy briefings. "No," she finally admitted, her voice quiet. "Our leaders do not do such things. They have representatives, ministers of agriculture, advisors, but they themselves—" She trailed off. The farmer nodded, not with judgment but with understanding. "Then perhaps they forget where true wealth comes from. Not from banks or factories, but from here, from the earth and the hands that work it." As the visit concluded, the farmers gathered to see them off. They began singing, a traditional working song that spoke of planting seeds, enduring hardships, and celebrating harvests. The harmony was natural, unrehearsed, and deeply moving. Madame Moreau felt tears prick at her eyes, though she fought to maintain her composure. These people, with their calloused hands and simple clothing, possessed something she and all her sophisticated colleagues had somehow lost, a genuine connection to what truly mattered in human existence. On the drive back, she remained silent, watching the landscape pass. Ibrahim respected her silence, understanding that transformation requires quiet reflection. Finally, she spoke. "President Traoré, I have spent my entire career believing that development meant becoming more like us. More Western, more modern, more detached from traditional ways. But what if we have been wrong? What if in our rush to modernize, we have lost something essential? What if these farmers, with their connection to the land and to each other, are actually wealthier than we are?" Ibrahim smiled gently. "Madame, development should not mean abandoning who you are to become a copy of someone else. It should mean strengthening what makes you unique while learning what is genuinely useful from others. We can build roads without losing our stories. We can have schools without forgetting our elders' wisdom. We can grow economically without sacrificing our dignity or our community bonds. This is what true development looks like, growth that strengthens rather than replaces culture." That evening at the palace, Madame Moreau requested a private meeting with President Ibrahim. When they met in his modest office, she noticed details she had overlooked before, photographs of him with ordinary citizens, children's drawings pinned to a wall, a worn book of traditional proverbs on his desk. "President Traoré," she began, and for the first time her voice held no trace of condescension. "I have been thinking about everything I have witnessed these past days. I need to understand something. Where does this unity come from? How have you achieved this bond between leadership and people that seems impossible in my own nation?" Ibrahim considered her question carefully before responding. "Tomorrow I will show you the answer. But I warn you, it may be difficult to witness. Are you prepared to see the true cost of what you have observed? She nodded, uncertain what he meant but committed to seeing this journey through to its end. The next morning, they traveled to a place Ibrahim called the Memorial Field. It was a vast open space on the outskirts of the city, carefully maintained and profoundly peaceful. Rows of marble headstones stretched across the landscape, each marking a grave, each bearing a name and dates. This, Ibrahim said softly, is our nation's most precious treasure. As they walked among the graves, Ibrahim stopped at specific markers, sharing stories that brought each name to life. This man was a farmer who sold his land to buy food for soldiers during our independence struggle. He could have fled to safety, could have protected his own interests. Instead, he gave everything. He died poor, but he died free, and his sacrifice helped secure freedom for millions. He moved to another grave. This woman was a teacher. When the colonial forces attacked her school, she refused to leave the children. She shielded them with her own body. 7 children survived because of her courage. Another marker. This young man was only 17. He could have stayed silent, could have survived by collaboration. Instead, he spoke truth, organized resistance, and paid with his life. Story after story. Grave after grave, each representing someone who had valued dignity and freedom more than personal safety, who had chosen sacrifice over submission. Madame Moreau felt tears flowing freely now, no longer attempting to hide them. "These people," she whispered, "they gave everything." "Yes," Ibrahim confirmed. "And their children, their grandchildren, all of us who live now, we remember. We remember that our freedom, our dignity, our right to stand proud in the world was purchased with their blood. How can I, as president, dishonor their sacrifice by treating our people as less than fully human? How can I accept disrespect from foreign powers when these people died refusing to accept disrespect? The dignity you have witnessed is not something I created. It was purchased by them, and I merely strive to honor it." A young boy approached, carrying fresh flowers. He placed them carefully on one of the graves, then turned to Ibrahim. "President Traoré, my grandfather is buried here. My father tells me he was a hero." "Is that true?" Ibrahim knelt down to the boy's level. "Yes, your grandfather was a hero. Not because he was powerful or famous, but because he believed that some things, dignity, freedom, justice, matter more than life itself. You carry his name and his legacy. Honor it by living with the same courage." The boy nodded solemnly, then turned to Madame Moreau. With a child's directness, he asked, "Lady, will you remember my grandfather? Will you tell people in your country about him?" Madame Moreau found her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, child. I will remember. I promise you, I will remember." As they prepared to leave the memorial field, Ibrahim spoke once more. "Madame, you came here believing you would teach us about civilization, about progress, about how to properly govern. But this is what you needed to see. Civilization is not measured by buildings or technology. It is measured by how a people treat each other, how they remember sacrifice, how they honor dignity. We may not have your wealth, but we have this, a living connection to those who paid the highest price for our freedom. And we will never dishonor their sacrifice by accepting treatment that diminishes our worth as human beings." The final full day of Madame Moreau's visit arrived. President Ibrahim had organized a national gathering, a massive assembly in the central plaza where thousands of citizens would come together. When Madame Moreau learned of this plan, her first instinct was anxiety. Large crowds, unpredictable emotions, the risk of confrontation, it seemed potentially dangerous. But Ibrahim assured her, "Madame, you have nothing to fear. My people are not violent, they are proud. They do not seek to harm you, they seek to be seen by you." As their convoy approached the plaza, the scale of the gathering became apparent. Tens of thousands of people filled the space. Farmers in their work clothes, women in traditional dress, children waving flags, elders seated in places of honor. The air vibrated with energy, with drums, with singing, with the collective voice of a nation asserting its identity. When Ibrahim's vehicle appeared, the crowd erupted in celebration. Not with hatred toward the foreign visitor, but with pride in their own identity. Banners proclaimed, "Dignity is our identity." Unity is our strength. We stand together. Madame Moreau stepped from the vehicle, and for a moment the crowd fell silent. Thousands of eyes focused on her, not with anger, but with a profound question written on every face. Will you finally see us? Ibrahim led her to a raised platform where they could be seen by the assembled masses. An elder approached the microphone, his voice amplified across the plaza. "People of Ouagadougou," he called out. "We have gathered today not in anger but in pride. We gather to show our guest what she could not see before, that we are not a nation that needs charity or pity. We are a nation that demands respect." The crowd roared in agreement. But it was not a threatening sound. It was the sound of collective dignity asserting itself. Another speaker, a young woman, took the microphone. "I am a teacher. I educate our children with limited resources but unlimited love. I do not need outsiders to tell me how to teach my students. I need them to provide us the resources we have been denied by centuries of exploitation, and then to step back and trust that we know our children better than any foreign expert ever could." More applause, more affirmation. A farmer spoke. "We feed this nation with our hands and our sweat. We do not need lectures on agricultural efficiency from those who have never worked a field in their lives. We need fair prices for our crops. We need infrastructure to bring our goods to market. We need respect for the knowledge we carry in our bones from generations of working this soil." Speaker after speaker, each one articulating not grievances, but assertions of dignity and competence. They were not asking for permission to be respected. They were claiming that respect as their inherent right. Finally, Ibrahim himself spoke to the crowd. "My people, our guest has witnessed your dignity these past days. She has heard your stories, met your children, seen your work. The question now is not whether we will accept disrespect. We will not. The question is whether the world will finally understand that nations are not made great by wealth or weapons, but by the dignity of their people and the bonds that unite them." The crowd's response shook the very ground, a thunderous affirmation that seemed to roll across the plaza like a physical force. Ibrahim turned to Madame Moreau, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. "This is what you did not understand when you arrived. You saw poverty and assumed weakness. You saw simplicity and assumed ignorance. But what you did not see was this: a people united in their sense of worth, unwilling to accept diminishment regardless of material circumstances. This unity, this collective dignity, is a force more powerful than any army, more enduring than any empire. You cannot defeat it, you cannot buy it, you cannot ignore it. You can only respect it." Madame Moreau looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, rich and poor, all standing together in solidarity. And in that moment, the last walls of her arrogance finally, completely crumbled. She stepped forward to the microphone, her hands trembling. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "People of Ouagadougou," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "I came to your nation with arrogance and ignorance. I believed I had lessons to teach you. I was wrong." She paused, struggling to continue. "You have taught me more in these few days than I learned in decades of education and diplomatic work. You have shown me that true wealth is not measured in money but in dignity. That true strength is not in weapons but in unity. That true civilization is not in buildings but in how a people treat each other and honor those who sacrificed for their freedom." Tears flowed openly down her face now. "I apologize for my disrespect. I apologize for my blindness. And I promise I will carry what I have learned here back to my nation. I will tell them that we do not have all the answers, that we have much to learn, and that respect must flow both ways between nations." For a long moment, silence held. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. Others joined, and soon the applause rolled across the plaza, not celebrating her words, but acknowledging her transformation, accepting her apology, and affirming that dignity recognizes dignity. A small girl broke from the crowd and ran to the platform. She held out a simple bracelet woven from local fibers. "For you," she said shyly. "So you remember us?" Madame Moreau knelt down, accepting the gift with shaking hands. She pulled the child into an embrace, and in that moment, she was no longer a proud French diplomat, but simply a human being recognizing the humanity of another. That evening, in the quiet of her room, Madame Moreau wrote in her journal, "I arrived in Ouagadougou believing I understood the world and my place in it. I have left understanding nothing except that I must begin learning again, this time with humility rather than arrogance. These people, whom I dismissed as primitive, have taught me what my expensive education never could. That dignity cannot be bought or granted. It must be claimed and honored. That wealth without dignity is poverty, and dignity without wealth is still richness. That a nation's greatness is not measured in GDP or military might, but in how its people treat each other and how they stand together in the face of disrespect. I have been humbled, and I am grateful for it. The pain of having my arrogance stripped away was necessary and right. I only hope I can carry this lesson forward and that others might learn without having to first fall as far as I did." The next morning, as she prepared to depart, the palace was filled with people who had come to see her off, not because protocol demanded it, but because word had spread of her transformation, and people wanted to affirm it with their presence. Children presented her with drawings depicting the stories she had heard. Women gave her small handcrafted items, not valuable by monetary standards, but precious as symbols of acceptance and forgiveness. Men shook her hand with genuine warmth, their earlier wariness replaced by cautious respect. President Ibrahim walked with her to the waiting vehicle. Before she entered, she turned to him one final time. "President Traoré, I want you to know you could have humiliated me. You could have rejected me, mocked my ignorance, punished my disrespect. Instead, you educated me." "Why?" Ibrahim smiled. "Madame, humiliation would have only hardened your heart and confirmed your prejudices. You would have returned to France angry and even more convinced of your superiority. Instead, I chose to show you truth. Truth has a power that anger never possesses. It transforms rather than hardens. My people did not need revenge against your arrogance. They needed you to truly see them. And now you do." "I do," she affirmed. "I truly do." As her vehicle pulled away, she watched through the rear window as the crowd waved farewell. The same dusty streets, the same simple buildings, the same material poverty, but now she saw it all through completely different eyes. She saw richness where she had seen deprivation, strength where she had seen weakness, wisdom where she had seen ignorance. Weeks after Madame Moreau's departure, a letter arrived at the presidential palace. It was from her, written on official French diplomatic stationery, but in a tone utterly different from the formal communications that usually characterized such correspondence. "President Traoré," it read, "I have returned to Paris and resumed my duties, but I am not the same person who left. I have presented my report on Ouagadougou to my superiors, but it was not the report they expected. I did not recommend interventions or reforms. Instead, I recommended learning. I described what I witnessed, a nation that, despite limited resources, has achieved something we have lost: genuine unity between leaders and people, authentic dignity maintained in the face of hardship, and a sense of purpose rooted in community rather than individual ambition. My report was not well received by everyone. Some colleagues dismissed it as naive idealism. Others suggested I had been somehow manipulated. But a few, particularly younger diplomats, have asked me to tell them more. They sense, as I now understand, that something essential is missing from our approach to international relations and development. I have begun speaking at universities, sharing the stories I heard in your villages, describing the memorial field and the national gathering. Some students cry when I describe the sacrifice of those who purchased your freedom. Others grow quiet and thoughtful, perhaps questioning their own assumptions about civilization and progress. The bracelet the child gave me hangs on my wall. I look at it every morning as a reminder that true value cannot be measured in monetary terms, and that the greatest gifts often come from the smallest hands. President Ibrahim read the letter aloud to his advisors. One of them, an older man who had fought in the independence struggle, spoke thoughtfully. "This is a greater victory than any military conquest could achieve. We have not defeated an enemy, we have transformed one. We have turned arrogance into understanding, contempt into respect. This is the power of dignity, maintained with patience and wisdom." The story of Madame Moreau's visit spread throughout Ouagadougou and beyond. It became a teaching tale, shared in schools and villages, told and retold with variations but always maintaining its essential truth. Dignity cannot be destroyed by poverty or granted by wealth. It exists inherently in human beings and must be honored regardless of material circumstances. Years later, a new generation of students in Ouagadougou would study this episode in their history classes. Teachers would ask, "What did President Ibrahim understand that Madame Moreau did not?" And students would answer, "That strength without dignity is merely force, but dignity without material strength is still power." The story also traveled to other nations, particularly in Africa, where it resonated deeply with peoples who had similarly struggled against colonial attitudes and post-colonial condescension. It became a symbol of how dignity could be asserted not through violence or anger, but through the quiet, persistent demonstration of one's full humanity. 5 years after that transformative visit, an international conference on development was held in Geneva. Madame Lucille Moreau was invited to speak, now as someone whose perspective had become well known in diplomatic circles. Some praised her honesty about her own transformation. Others viewed her with suspicion, seeing her changed views as a betrayal of Western values and interests. She stood before the assembled delegates, representatives from dozens of nations, international organizations, NGOs, and academic institutions, and began her presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, 5 years ago, I traveled to a small African nation called Ouagadougou with absolute certainty about what I would find and what needed to be done. I arrived prepared to diagnose problems and prescribe solutions. I left having been diagnosed myself, my own poverty of understanding having been exposed." She described her journey: the village storyteller, the child offering water, the farmers, the memorial field, the national gathering. She spoke without notes, from memory and from the heart, and her words carried a conviction that no scripted speech could match. "I learned that we in the wealthy nations have confused material abundance with human richness. We have equated technological advancement with wisdom. We have mistaken economic dominance for moral authority, and in doing so, we have blinded ourselves to forms of wealth that cannot be quantified in GDP. Statistics or development indices. The people of Ouagadougou possess something we have largely lost, a sense of collective dignity that transcends individual circumstances. They have maintained bonds of community that our individualistic culture has eroded. They have preserved wisdom traditions that our obsession with novelty has caused us to discard. They are not perfect, no nation is, but in certain fundamental ways, they are richer than we are. My recommendation today is radical. Before we presume to develop other nations, perhaps we should consider what we might learn from them. True international cooperation cannot be based on the assumption that one party has all the knowledge and the other merely needs instruction. It must be based on mutual respect, on the recognition that wisdom comes in many forms, and that dignity is the birthright of every human being regardless of nationality or economic status. The speech generated significant discussion. Some delegates approached her afterward to express appreciation. Others pointedly avoided her. But seeds had been planted, conversations had been sparked, and assumptions had been challenged. That evening, Madame Moreau returned to her hotel room and wrote another letter to President Ibrahim. "Dear friend, for I hope I may now call you that, I spoke today to diplomats and development experts trying to convey what you taught me. I do not know if I succeeded. Some seemed to understand. Others looked at me with the same condescension I once directed toward you. The irony is not lost on me, but I will continue to speak, to write, to teach, because the lesson is too important to let die with my own experience. The world needs to hear that dignity is universal, that respect cannot be one-directional, and that the true measure of civilization is not in what we possess, but in how we treat others. Thank you for not turning me away when I deserved it. Thank you for showing me truth when you could have shown me the door. Thank you for transforming my contempt into respect. I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor the gift you gave me." A decade after that fateful visit, a documentary filmmaker traveled to Ouagadougou to create a film about President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership style. Inevitably, the story of Madame Moreau's visit became a central element of the documentary. The filmmaker interviewed people who had been present during those transformative days. The elderly storyteller, Grandmother Amina, now even more frail but still sharp-minded, reflected on the episode. That French woman arrived wearing her pride like armor. We could have attacked that armor with our own pride, creating a battle that would have solved nothing. Instead, President Ibrahim chose to show her truth. The truth of who we are, what we value, how we live. Truth is like water. It finds the cracks in even the strongest armor and seeps through, transforming from within. That is what happened to her. The young girl who had offered water, now a teenager studying to become a teacher herself, remembered, "I was so nervous. My hands were shaking because I knew this was important." When she drank the water, everyone cheered. But I remember looking at her face. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand why it mattered so much. But by the end of her visit, I think she understood. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the largest meanings. The farmer from the marketplace reflected, "Before President Traoré, we were always told we were poor, that we needed help, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps wealthy nations chose to give us. He taught us differently. He taught us that poverty is not having dignity. Everything else is just circumstances that can change. That French woman learned the same lesson we learned. We are all still learning it." President Ibrahim himself, interviewed in the same modest office where he had worked throughout his presidency, spoke thoughtfully about the incident. Madame Moreau was not a villain. She was simply a product of a system that teaches some people they are inherently superior to others. Such systems damage both those they elevate and those they diminish. Our task was not to punish her for her arrogance, but to free her from it. In doing so, we demonstrated not just our dignity, but our understanding that we are all diminished when any of us accept artificial hierarchies of human worth. The story is not really about her transformation, though that was genuine and significant. The story is about a principle. Every human being, regardless of their nationality, economic status, or background, possesses inherent dignity. That dignity can be disrespected, but it cannot be destroyed. It can be overlooked, but it cannot be erased. And when people stand together in affirmation of their collective dignity, no force on earth can ultimately diminish them. The documentary, when released, generated international attention. It won awards at film festivals, was shown in universities and policy institutions, and sparked countless discussions about development, dignity, and the nature of true wealth. But perhaps its most profound impact was personal. Viewers around the world, some wealthy, some poor, some from former colonial powers, some from formerly colonized nations, found themselves reflecting on their own assumptions and prejudices. Letters poured in from people who had been moved to reconsider how they viewed others, how they defined success, how they measured human worth. In Ouagadougou itself, the story became woven into the national identity. Children still learned it in schools, not as history but as living wisdom. The simple truths it embodied, that dignity transcends circumstances, that respect must be mutual, that material poverty need not mean spiritual poverty, that patience and truth are more powerful than anger and force, continued to guide the nation's development and its interactions with the wider world. And far away in Paris, in an elegant apartment filled with artifacts from decades of diplomatic service, an aging Madame Lucille Moreau kept a simple woven bracelet in a frame on her wall. Visitors who asked about it received more than a simple explanation. They received a story that changed how they saw the world. That bracelet, she would tell them, her eyes reflecting memories both painful and precious, was given to me by a child in Ouagadougou. It is worth nothing in monetary terms, but it represents the most valuable thing I have ever received, the gift of seeing my own blindness, recognizing it, and being freed from it. I was wealthy when I went to Ouagadougou, but I came back rich. There is a difference, you see, and understanding that difference changes everything. The lesson endures. True dignity cannot be bought, sold, granted, or destroyed. It can only be recognized, honored, and celebrated. And in that recognition lies the foundation for genuine human connection across all the artificial boundaries that divide us. The end.